Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the 6th episode of Wolf School Season 2. We'll give it about a minute to let people arrive and settle into this space. If you're calling in from YouTube, you can use the chat function to participate in this talk today. So as you sign in here, please let us know where you're calling in from, whose ancestral territory you might be on. It's always really interesting to hear where folks are calling in from when they join our webinars. If you're tuning in for the first time, welcome. My name is Chelsea and I work with Raincoast Conservation Foundation. For those of you who have been tuning into Wolf School over the past couple months, it's so great to have you back. If you missed any of the first 5 episodes of this season, you can find all the recordings on Raincoast's YouTube channel, which is where you are watching from now if you're watching live. And then you can also find our first season of Wolf School on this channel or on our website at the link below. All right. Well, we've got some folks in the audience that I can see. People are calling in from Colorado, from Vancouver, Toronto, Alaska, South Carolina. Great to have all of you. Okay, so again, feel free to use the chat as you come in, but we're going to get started here. So to everyone who's watching, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Chelsea Greer, and today I'm hosting you from the shared unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam peoples, also known as the City of Vancouver in Canada. I know we may have some folks calling in from different parts of the world who may not know this about British Columbia, but today most of the province remains unceded sovereign native lands, and this means that this land was never surrendered, relinquished, or handed over in any way. So I'm here on this land as a settler. My family names have roots in England and Scotland. And within these shared territories, not so far away from where I'm hosting you from today, is the site of Sanok Village. These lands and waters were once ideal for fishing and hunting and harvesting traditional resources. There was an abundance of elk, deer, beaver, salmon, cedar, and so much more. And Sanok was a place of gathering, culture, spirituality, and governance. So I just want to express my gratitude and appreciation to be here working, living, and talking to all of you on this unceded land that remains rich with history and stories that have occurred for thousands of years. And I want to welcome all of you to make your own land acknowledgements in the chat box. So I work with Raincoast Conservation Foundation as director of our Wolf Conservation Program. And again, this is the 6th class of our 2nd season of Wolf School. And for those of you who are new to Raincoast, we are a charitable nonprofit organization made up of a team of scientists and conservationists who are empowered by our research to protect the lands, waters, and wildlife of coastal British Columbia in Canada. And with this series, we want to provide you with the opportunity to learn more about wolves. And in this season, we've been exploring the role of animal welfare and environmental ethics in wolf conservation research, policy, and practice. And in this episode today, we'll also be exploring the social dimensions, particularly as it relates to conservation and policy. So again, audience members are tuning in today using YouTube, so you can participate by entering any questions you might have on into the chat on this platform. And I'll be monitoring the chat throughout the session and collect as many questions as I can to pose to our guest speaker throughout the session. And lastly, Raincoast is running this Wolf School in collaboration with the Wolf Conservation Center. And if you missed our class with them, you can watch the recording on our YouTube channel to learn more about the ethics of reintroduction programs for Mexican gray wolf recovery in the US. So again, as always, a big thank you to them and also to everyone who has been watching and sharing information about Wolf School as well as donating. We really appreciate your support. Okay, well now it is my privilege to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Chris Darramont. Chris is a professor, an engaged scholar, and the Raincoast Chair of Applied Conservation Science Lab in the Department of Geography at the University of Victoria. Chris earned a PhD in ecology and evolution from the biology department at the University of Victoria and completed a postdoc at the University of California, Santa Cruz. As an interdisciplinary researcher, Chris has been influenced by a broad network of mentors and collaborators, including colleagues, friends, and knowledge holders among the Heiltsuk, Wiikanu, Kitasoo-Hehe, and Nuxalk nations. Chris has had a long-term affiliation with Raincoast Conservation Foundation And with Dr. Paul Paquette, Chris led Raincoast's Rainforest Wolf Project from 2000 to 2010. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks so much, Chelsea. Delighted to be here, and I'm going to launch my slideshow. And can you confirm you can see it?
Yes, okay, we can see it. Take
Super.
it away.
Thank you. So, as Chelsea mentioned, it's a bit of a mix and match. I would like to share some stories and some photos and a little bit of data and information about I think one of the coolest animals on the planet, not just the gray wolf, but specifically the gray wolf that inhabits these beautiful coastal temperate rainforests in British Columbia. Also, I want to talk with you, at least introduce the concept and maybe have more of a conversation about what we refer to as a social license to hunt, as it in particular refers to large carnivores in the context of sport and trophy hunting, and how such license may be eroding across generations and into the future. As Chelsea mentioned, I have worked with many wonderful people. The people that I'd like to specifically mention are my early and continuing mentors. Um, and you'll see them here. Paul Paquette, Director of Science for Raincoast at the top, my former PhD advisor, Dr. Tom Reimken, and then last, certainly not least, perhaps the most important of all, the late Chester Starr of the Heiltsuk First Nation. And one of the stories today I have to share revolves around Chester. Before I get into that story and some information about these fabulous wolves, I'd like to acknowledge that most of what you hear, most of the photographs that you'll see, most of what we have learned about these special wolves come from Heiltsuk territory or Haisuk territory on the central coast of what's now called British Columbia. So, whereas I'm currently sitting here at the interface of Wasanich territory and Lekwungen territories of the Songhees and Esquimalt. Much of what I'm drawing on is Heiltsuk in origin. One of my favorite memories of being with Chester, and I was reflecting on this today, I think it's about almost exactly 23 years ago today. It was early to mid May in the year 2000. We were just day two of the Rainforest Wolf Project. And in those days, it was just Chester and I. Chester was known as Lone Wolf on the VHF as his call sign, because it very much matched his personality. Prior to spending so much time with me in the bush over the next 10 years that followed this story, Chester liked to be out in the bush by himself, learning about wildlife, hunting, fishing, etc. He was a lone wolf. And however, we developed a very close bond and friendship. On this day in May, we were in this channel. It's called Bullock Channel. It's about uh, 1 hour's boat ride north of Bella Bella, which I'll show you on a map soon. And to your right, you see a mainland, some more mountainous terrain, and further to the right and kind of in the distance is a coast mountain range. So that's the mainland. Then to your left or to the west are a series of islands. This is an archipelago landscape comprised of many, many islands. It gets less topographically complex, a little more boggy, definitely a little more marine oriented as you go west. We were sitting in that channel having lunch. I had thrown the anchor and it was a sunny day like this. And Chester asked me the most peculiar question. He asked, "Are we here to study the island wolves?" as he looked to the west. "Or are we going to study those bigger timber wolves?" As he pointed to the mainland. And he was letting me know in his indirect, informal, but deeply knowledgeable way that there was, in fact, not one wolf population there, but two distinct types of wolves, even within this one coastal temperate rainforest. And at that time, I didn't yet know what I didn't know, if you know what I mean. That is to say, I didn't yet know how important that question and knowledge transmission by Chester to me was. I didn't know how important it was until years later. So a lot of what I'll share with you in the next 10 minutes is some information and reflecting on that early insight from Chester. Before we get into it, I just want to give you a little more about Raincoast because it may help you understand what we did and why we did it back 23 years ago and still very much to the day using the same model at Raincoast. Our mandate is three parts. One, using the best available science, which is also often our own. We investigate conservation problems and sometimes opportunities. In those days, we were coming off the 90s, a period of very rapid, severe changes to those coastal temperate rainforests with lots of industrial clear cut logging done by outsiders to these territories. And there was grave concerns informed by the wolves of Southeast Alaska, just a little bit to the north, that when a lot of coastal temperate rainforest comes down and are turned into 2x4s, the predator prey system can be thrown into distress. And we were worried and concerned that the same fate that was befalling and remains relevant to wolves to the north and southeast Alaska could happen to wolves of the much more intact at the time coastal rainforests of British Columbia. Now, knowing that science alone is not enough, even as academics, what we do additionally as applied scholars, many of us at Raincoast and applied conservationists, is we inform decision makers in those days. The groups of people from various orders of government, including Indigenous governments, industry, the conservation constellation of organizations, etc., inform them in their land use planning processes that was to determine the fate of these forests. Third, knowing that decision makers may not get it right sometimes, we additionally aim to inspire the public. So the public asks more of decision makers, complementing the evidence that we provide decision makers. So decision makers get information from scientists and they get, for lack of a better word, some motivation or pressure from the public that feels inspired about perhaps a better vision for these rainforests or whatever the case may be. So that very much oriented our work and remains our central orientation. How the work was done, it was did not involve any capture, anesthetizing wolves, pulling teeth, putting on radio telemetry collars, etc. More, we were putting on our gumboots and walking in the footsteps of these wild wolves, picking up what they left behind. Here's just a lovely, gorgeous picture of a wolf scat. It's a little bit weathered, but I like it because you can see some evidence of what it ate. In this case, it ate a deer. You can see a little black hoof in there and some bone and some winter pelage of Sitka black-tailed deer. We also, on occasion, when we could, when we knew of locations of den sites and rendezvous sites, or even resting sites in the spring when wolves were shedding, we would pick up their hair. And I will soon show you how important that technique was in informing us about how wolves made their living on the coast of BC. So after not too long, we had literally mountains of wolf scat bottled up for genetics in these little red autoclave bags for dietary analysis and more. As I've mentioned, we collected most of these data in the long-term project in Heltzik territory around Bella Bella, the central of that image, center portion of that image, but we also surveyed the entire central and north coast of British Columbia, the so-called Great Bear Rainforest, some 60,000 square kilometers, 20-something thousand square miles, roughly twice the size of El Salvador. We surveyed by boat over the summers of 2000 and 2001, all the way back the inlets, to the end of the inlets and the kind of the toes of the coast mountain range to the east, all the way to the western outermost islands from something called Cape Caution, darkly on the southern part of the central coast up to the border of southeast Alaska. So some of the data, and I'm just going to show you a little bit in a hopefully digestible way, come from the Heltzick study area. Some come from a larger study area. I want to show you a little bit about how ecologically different these wolves of coastal temperate rainforests are. And one of the fundamental aspects of ecology is who eats whom and predator prey dynamics. And typically, in most ecosystems, wolves focus on ungulate prey, things with hooves, deer, moose, caribou, elk, etc. And so much so that maybe 80% or more of a wolf's diet is ungulates wherever wolves still exist. And that was sort of the default, maybe naive expectation in this environment. However, this environment is very much connected to the ocean. So I want to show you some of our earliest data published back in 2005, where we looked at the contents and we picked out the the clues to the crime, so to speak. It's not a crime to eat. Let's say the clues to identify what wolves had eaten in about 600 scats. And on that vertical axis, we're plotting model output, or the relationship between the probability that deer occurred in a scat. So, for example, the probability that in any one place, wolves would eat deer for a meal. And on the horizontal axis, we categorized how far from the mainland each island on which these scats were collected occurred. So we're interested in the relationship between how isolated an island was from the mainland and the probability that a wolf would eat a deer for a meal. And I've drawn that reference line at 0.8 or 80% to orient us to what we might expect if wolves were doing the same thing on the coast as they did elsewhere, and that is eat deer. We find a very different pattern. Starts off at about 80%, but falls to near zero on these offshore islands. So what else are they eating? For that, we turn to their hair, and we use a chemical analysis that basically draws on the reality that you are what you eat. If you eat nothing but bananas, your hair will be grown from the same molecules that came from bananas. And it's very helpful in carbon and nitrogen space to know that various items, food items in the landscape, look different chemically according to their carbon and nitrogen signatures. So I'm giving away part of the story here, but we create this food web in in chemical space here, comprised of deer, salmon, and shorthand marine mammals. We see a mink, river otter, and seal are the primary marine mammals. And if we did some of the math right and we plot what the hair from wolves that consume across this biochemical space, we hope that the wolves would plot inside that triangle. And indeed they do. We find that wolves of the mainland, consistent with what I just showed you, are eating about 3/4 of their diet from terrestrial organisms, mainly deer, but we go just to what we call the inner islands, just immediately adjacent to the mainland. That ratio now becomes 50-50. 50% of what these terrestrial top predators are eating is seafood. Let's go to the outer islands. That's just one more island out, and that ratio, the sample sizes are modest, but that ratio is on average 75% seafood. Some of the wolves out there are eating 95% or more of their foods from the ocean environment. So very different ecologically. Want to tell a quick story about salmon and wolves foraging on salmon that hadn't been described in the literature. Chester Starr and other health six knew that wolves did this. It was very rarely seen, but this was seen commonly. This is a decapitated pink salmon. This is not the work of a bear, which would target the eggs of this female pink, but the work, I was told by Chester, of a wolf. So I resolved to witness this, videotape it, describe it scientifically. My first ill-advised plan was to get up in a tree and spend the night right over where wolves were foraging on salmon below me. I went up one night as it was getting dark. It got darker, darker, darker. No one showed. It got dark. It started to rain. And then I could hear some wolves beneath me fishing and eating fish. And then they were only about 10 minutes into it, where I'm sure they just lifted up their muzzle, had a sniff, and detected a most unwelcome intruder into their dining room. And that was me. And they took off, and it was a mistake I made and resolved never to make again. And instead, for the rest of that fall, I would play the wind downstream early in the morning. Those cold winds would rush down these watersheds. So I was firmly downwind of them, and I got to see multiple members of multiple packs doing the same stereotypical fishing behavior, watching these salmon plunging their muzzle into the water and carting off the salmon to eat. As I've mentioned, they would eat only a portion of that salmon and leave the rest of this nutrient-rich salmon full of nitrogen and phosphorus for the rest of the consumers, the scavengers in the environment to eat, including the plants that eventually eat in their own plant way the nitrogen and phosphorus left over from that fish. So in this way, and in other ways that you're probably familiar with, wolves are certainly providers to the ecosystem. I like to share this art that whereas this this painting by my friend Martin Campbell, also of Bella Bella, a Celtic artist, was something we commissioned. This one was something. This was a painting that Martin was inspired to make for us in response to some of the photos we shared, and I wanted to share that with you. So not only are wolves ecologically quite different in their strong coupling to the ocean, behaviorally different in terms of fishing for food, but they look different on the coast compared to wolves elsewhere. There's a bit less frequency of the black morphology compared to other areas. There are basically no pure white wolves in the area, and most of the gray morphs, which are 80 to 90%, most of the gray colored wolves, gray black colored wolves, have this lovely red ochre coloration, especially to the ears, face, along the legs. You can see that really prominently in the top left and a little less so in the bottom right image. Beautiful and very different from other areas of North America where we still have wolves. So ecologically distinct, behaviorally very different, morphologically or how they look, they're very different. More than skin deep? Their difference. And as it turns out, some of our early genetic work, we're just showing the distribution of what are called haplotypes. Don't worry about what that means. It's just a particular marker that you get from your mother's lineage if you're a wolf. And you see just visually, if you have good color vision, you'll see that the distribution of the different types or colors of haplotypes are very different on the coast compared to the interior. And in fact, we compared how different these wolves of the coast are to wolves of the interior of BC and beyond, and estimated that these wolves of the coast are more different from any other North American wolf population than those populations are from one another. So a very what we call divergent group of wolves genetically. And most of that genetic variation mapped onto the distribution of coastal prey, what we call coastal biogeoclimatic zones. So very much a case of ecology driving genetic variation. I want to go back to my first story with which I started back to that channel in Celtic territory. And I recall that I told you that Chester relayed to me that wolves of the mainland are different from wolves of the island. This is within the coastal domain. So I've just told you that wolves of the coast, mainland and islands, are different from wolves of the interior. But how about within that coastal population of wolves? Chester was right, and I didn't have to do this work, my colleagues and I. We could have and maybe should have just believed Chester, but scientists being scientists, we were interested in this tantalizing hypothesis that we were able to test, not to validate Chester's information. It didn't need to be validated. We're just using a different vantage, a different set of tools that Chester and his ancestors had used over thousands of years to discriminate between these wolves. We were just using a different and perhaps complementary tool of genetics. I won't share with you the nitty gritty here, but we can see in the top left that wolves of the mainland, or MA, separate in what we refer to as genetic space from the wolves of the islands, or IS there, very much aligning with what Chester had told me so many years ago. That would have been 13, 14 years after Chester had first informed and inspired us to do that work. So, with that, I want to give another shout out to late Chester Star Lone Wolf. And in the next minute or two, I just want to wet our whistles for a discussion about what we refer to as a social license to hunt. And what we've done as scholars and applied scholars in a social science domain is really just piggyback off of what other scholars had done in the context of mining, forestry, other resource extraction industries, where they differentiate between the regulatory environment, how the government may regulate how a mine, or if a mine operates. And 20, 30 years ago, people interested in what happens in the real world understand and detailed how it isn't only or even primarily the government regulatory environment that is important. It's in fact the social environment, and something they refer to as a social license to operate, that matters a lot to mines, to forestry, and other resource extraction industries. So all we did in our work is piggyback off that idea, with the understanding that in the similar way, if we are to characterize wildlife as public resources, as forests are or minerals are, and maybe that's a questionable philosophical assignment, but legally that's how they're thought of. Socially, that's how they're thought of. Wildlife belong to everybody. So too should the extractors, not miners and foresters in this case, but hunters, be subject to social license to operate, to hunt. And whereas many, and actually most of society supports and affords social license to hunters like Chester, like myself, like some people at Raincoast that hunt for food, hunt primarily or exclusively herbivores for food. The opposite is true for the context of hunting primarily large carnivores in the context of sport or trophy, not to feed one's family, but to feed one's ego. There is very little societal support for that. So, what we're learning, and we learned during the end of the grizzly bear hunt in coastal British Columbia, and what people from California will remember about mountain lions, is these hunts were turned off by the government, not because of regulatory disapproval, not because there's too few mountain lions in California or too few grizzly bears left to hunt in British Columbia. No, rather the social license had been eroded. And this is a quote, a very important one from the minister at the time. We have listened to what British Columbians have to say on this issue, but and the grizzly hunt is not in line with their values. In other words, a social license to hunt had eroded, and the government was responding to the electorate. These are the data of opposition to hunting bears in BC over the years from polls in the context of social media and extended campaigns by coastal First Nations, Raincoast, and others. Likely had a massive influence on government coming to that conclusion, understanding that the values of British Columbians indeed didn't align with that policy. Will we see this for wolves in BC or wolves elsewhere? Too early to tell. Whether this sort of activity will continue into the future, whether there is social license afforded to this, my feeling is no, but the governments of the day don't understand that particularly well, and the legacy and disproportionately powerful lobby groups that want to maintain these behaviors and these policies have enduring influence. But ideally, one day, wolves in British Columbia and beyond can be free to be wolves. These are not things people eat. These are beautiful animals that can suffer like you and I. And to take a life, in my view, and happy to discuss this in the context of sport or trophy, is not something that aligns with my values. And so I do not afford my contribution of social license to the hunting of wolves. So with that, I think I will pass it back to Chelsea, and I'm very happy to engage in a conversation with you all.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. That was very interesting. And I want to dive a little bit more into the social license to hunt, but I was thinking we could first start with a couple questions regarding coastal wolves. There's a few questions from the audience,
Sure,
just some clarifications as well.
sure.
One question asker is wondering, if wolves only eat the head of a salmon, how does that provide enough nutrition?
Great question. Brains, as it turns out, are not only delicious, apparently, but highly nutritious. So, our brains, the brains of salmon, are comprised of lots of fats, energy dense fats, also some omega 3, omega 6 fatty acids that are very important for the nervous systems of and every system of those consumers, including us, that eat omega 3, omega 6s. So there is lots of energy dense nutrients in the brain, but they are foregoing eggs, which are just, and in some cases, richer in fat than the brain. So it's a bit of a puzzle why they don't eat the eggs like bears do. They're likely avoiding little parasite that concentrates in the viscera of a salmon, instead targeting uh, the head of the fish. But if a wolf can and does, as we've observed, eat literally dozens of fish heads a day, that's enough, or that's as much nutrients as they would get, or perhaps more, from their portion of a little Sitka black-tailed deer. So, and it does scale up if we still have enough salmon in these creeks, and that's one stressor facing this coast today for sure.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And this leads well into this next question too. And this is a great question because I was actually talking about this in the field as well. The size difference between coastal wolves and inland wolves. Coastal wolves are a little bit smaller. And when you
Yeah,
see that with bears, you see salmon eating bears are much larger than
that's
berry
right.
eating bears.
Yeah.
So someone was wondering, do they look different from other wolves because of their seafood diet?
Maybe in their beautiful pelage. It's well known within people that eat a lot of these nice fatty acids and a healthy diet. There's healthy hair. So I'm just speculating that their pelage is especially nice on the coast because of salmon. But unlike bears who enter what's called hyperphagia, they just eat and eat and eat and can double their mass in a season. Wolves don't work like that. They don't have the extra storage capability that bears evolved to make it through winter sleep. But wolves are awake all winter, and so they'll fill their bellies, but that's it. And they'll put on some weight for sure as they're going into the leaner winter months, but no, they don't balloon up like our coastal bears do. And they are, on average, at least data from Alaska tell us, where there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of wolves killed every year on the coast and in the interior. The coastal wolves are about 20% less massive, have less weight than wolves of the interior. And so I suspect the same is the case on our coast.
Okay, interesting. And you mentioned Alaska, so I wanted to ask, what is being done to protect this unique population of coastal wolves, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about the conservation status of nearby wolves in Southeast Alaska.
Yeah, so in BC and Canada, the our wolves are not considered especially at risk, but I believe that's a very narrow perspective in space and time. You go just across a little border into Southeast Alaska, where there are many more roads, many more people living, and a much more developed hunting and trapping, especially industry, because there is industrial roots to that, to be sure. Uh, we know that up there in Southeast Alaska that wolves are not doing well at all, so much so that this is the third time in as many decades in which environmental groups have successfully petitioned the US Fish and Wildlife Service to consider endangered species listing for what is called the Alexander Archipelago wolf of Southeast Alaska. And so that's in the hands of the feds now. They have more than enough information they have to rule on it. They've ruled against it the last two times, but time will tell now. The main issues up there, in addition to over harvest or very high levels of killing wolves for trapping in particular, but also hunting, there is concern about having enough black-tailed deer prey in forests that have been industrially destroyed, modified for longer and to a greater extent than has occurred in coastal BC. The tree farms that grow in the place of these former old growth forests are closed canopy. That means not a lot of light gets down to the forest floor to feed a lot of deer over the long run. It may be good for 10, 20 years after clear cutting, but for the next 60 or 80 years, as those trees grow and shade out the forest floor, that's a very tough environment for deer to make a living. And if deer populations go down, so too will wolf populations. There are clearly, as I've shown, marine foods for wolves to capitalize on that may buffer them from such effects. But the bottom line, their data, their population data tell Alaska Department of Fish and Game and the feds that there are reasons to be concerned up there that relate to the overharvest and the industrial logging. So this is a cautionary tale for British Columbia, because in many ways coastal British Columbia is a few decades behind, thankfully, what has occurred in Southeast Alaska, and no one would want that future for wildlife or for people, quite frankly, in industrial landscape like Southeast Alaska.
And you said that wolves also are providers of the coast. Could you explain a little bit more about their habits, how their habits impact the ecosystems of the islands?
Sure. Yeah. So I spoke just very briefly about how wolves can be sort of like gardeners. So many gardeners may know that one way to feed your plants is to give them fish fertilizer. And they do that because fishes are high in nitrogen and carbon, and I guess easily accessible resources to do this. And plants love the extra nitrogen and respond. So just like black and grizzly bears that take out salmon from creeks from the aquatic and originally marine environment into the forest, they eat their portion of the salmon and leave the rest behind. And first, the little scavengers come in, anything from little pine martens to birds to even a little blowfly comes and lays her eggs, hundreds of eggs of flies in the rotting salmon carcass, and those grubs, and the flies become food for birds. Birds also directly forage on the rotting salmon. And then the leftovers from all those vertebrate and invertebrate scavengers eventually make their way into the pools of nitrogen available to these rainforest plants and shrubs and trees. So in this way, wolves, just like bears, are nice or effective coastal gardeners. So that's one way in which wolves provide for the ecosystem. Another one is a little more universal to other environments without salmon and marine prey, and that is wolves tend to regulate the herbivores, the ungulates in the environment. We know this because in areas where wolves and mountain lions and other top predators have been removed, things like deer their abundances can be up to an order of magnitude more. And what that does is denude or diminish the plant environment. So the deer are eating anything green in an environment at the expense of other animals that also need that base of the food web, the plants, to survive. So, in keeping deer, in this case, or ungulates more generally, in check by being predators of them, this ensures that the base of the food web, the plants, shrubs, etc., are more available, more productive, more um, biomass dense to the rest of the community. So in this way, also wolves are providers. Finally, this is not my story to tell, and stories will vary both across and within Indigenous cultures. One story that I know of that's owned by Norma Housty, Tumclux. Very briefly, this is not the story, but an element of the story that's really interesting is that a wolf was said to father the first of the Heiltsuk people. And some of the children remained wolves. Some of them became the first Heiltsuks, but some, the ones that remained wolves gave gifts to the first Heiltsuk people, gifts like salmon, gifts like uh, winter ceremonials. So in this way too, in this cultural, this Heiltsuk way, wolves are providers to the people. So that's a nice complement to the ecological provisioning that we tend to focus on.
Yeah, that's so special. Thanks for sharing that. And there's lots of questions coming in. I think just for the sake of time, I really want to dive into more social license to hunt related questions.
Sure.
And then if we have time at the end, we can go through some of the other questions that folks are writing in the chat.
Okay.
But I just kind of wanted to preface this too, in our first episode of Wolf School with Dr. John Vucetich, we explored the role of ethics in understanding key conservation issues, but, how we ought to value wolves and how we ought to behave when conservation issues related to wolves arise, for example, is actually different than how we actually behave. So what people think about wolves, their values and attitudes concerning the treatment of them, this falls into the realm of science, and so does the social license to hunt. And as Chris mentioned, I don't know if there's a few people that joined late. So in case you missed it, the social license to hunt is the informal but powerful permission society grants to and can withhold from those who exploit resources that are so-called publicly owned. So I wanted to, you touched on a few of these questions already, but I just wanted to kind of ask a little bit of a question around hunting. As you mentioned, Raincoast is not opposed to hunting for food, and the majority of hunters hunt for the purpose of obtaining food. But there's also variations in hunters' motivations to hunt. If you could talk a little bit about these different motivations.
Sure. Yeah. As scholars, we've dabbled in social sciences, or maybe more than dabbled, and in addition to thinking about the sociology and the social license to hunt, we've also, by extracting data from hunting forums and other sources of publicly available information, we have, and tapping into a literature of other social scientists that have done this, uh, have come to understand how what motivates hunters, and there could be multiple what's called satisfactions. How hunters are satisfied by their experiences, and that's just the difference between what a hunter expects and what a hunter experiences is defined as the satisfaction. So it's thought of as a multiple satisfactions environment, and we think of three different satisfactions that start with A. Number one is achievement. Men in particular really like hunting for the sense of achievement, and that can take all sorts of forms, but primarily killing something and displaying that achievement to others. Men in our ancestral, and I would argue contemporary environment, like to show off their hunting to other men, and probably to other, well, certainly to other people, women in particular. So achievement. The other one is affiliation. We like being with one another when we hunt. I now hunt with my older daughter, and that's a sense of affiliation. That's very important satisfaction within hunting. And then the third one is appreciation, appreciating the animal, the environment, the experience outside. When we look at how these satisfactions are expressed in hunting forums and other forms of expression by hunters, we find a very interesting pattern. Whereas hunters, and this is most hunters that are hunting for things that they eat, they will express those multiple satisfactions in fairly high and overlapping scenarios where all of these are important. When we look at expressions of hunters and the minority, I refer to them as the fringe minority of hunters that give other hunters a bad name socially. Those hunters that choose to hunt animals not to feed them or their family, but to, I believe, feed their ego. Primarily, what they're expressing is achievement satisfaction, this a motivation to signal their achievement to other men and maybe women, to express that they, in their minds, and probably this reflects some evolutionary baggage from our ancestral environment, to demonstrate that they have the physical or maybe mental capability to kill something bigger than them, something with weapons that carnivores have, like teeth, claws, etc. So very different motivations tend to map to these different types of hunting, hunting for food or hunting for ego, the trophy sport hunting. So that's in a nutshell, with a little bit of editorial, no doubt, the general summary of some of those papers that we've done over the years.
Yeah, and I think this basically answered my next question of what is the difference between hunting large carnivores like wolves and cougars and bears and hunting ungulates like elk and moose. I don't know if there's anything you might want to add to that.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. Not socially, but I don't think our audience needs a reminder. But it needs to be said. Two different things. Ecologically, they there could be very different consequences in that those animals we typically hunt for food, they tend to be more abundant, lower on the food web. There's more of them ecologically at a population level. It's a safer activity. And this is like different from ethics or the sociality or the um, sociology of hunting, but when we hunt large carnivores that tend to be lower density, this tends to be a little more risky in the context of conservation, where we hunt things that are rare to begin with and we remove them from ecosystems. So there's that difference there. Um, and one thing that I'll point out, and I guess it loops back to the ethics, though, in my view, and informed by my experience as a hunter too, that hunting will involve some suffering. It will, uh, and that's a reality for those of us that want to eat any meat or animal products. But one has to understand and consider the benefits that flow back from imposing this sort of suffering to individuals that have the very same physiology as you and I to feel pain and suffer. So is it worth it in my mind and in the minds of many other people to kill something not to provide a basic human need like food, or in rare cases of your personal safety? Most people would say yes. This is, and we see this reflected in data across North America. Most people accept that trade-off, but most people are, in fact, strongly opposed to causing the same sort of suffering, not to fulfill a basic human need like food, but for a trophy, for a head on the wall, for the stories that they'll post on Instagram about their wolf hunt. Most people, and not eat the animal and not kill it for eating. Most people are firmly opposed to that. So I'll just tie in that other difference at the end there.
Great. And just to give the audience a little bit of background with what Raincoast is doing to kind of protect wolves and other carnivores from trophy hunting. Over the past 13 years, with First Nations partners, Raincoast has purchased the commercial hunting rights in 5 guide outfitting tenures, totaling over 38,000 square kilometers or 9.4 million acres for our American viewers. Of the Great Bear Rainforest on the central coast of BC. And this is an area larger than Vancouver Island or the entire country of Belgium. And purchasing these tenures permanently protects several species from being commercially trophy hunted. And Chris, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how this protection, specifically of individual animals, works in BC.
Yeah, it's pretty neat. It's this wonderful. I mean, Raincoast has done so many things that are so different and creative and effective and novel, and this is one of them, the guide outfitting purchases. So in British Columbia, like many other jurisdictions in Canada and the United States, those hunters that come from beyond British Columbia need to hunt with a certified guide outfitter. And each guide outfitter holds the exclusive license, not to the land itself, but for the right to guide those foreign hunters. It's a big business. And under most scenarios, even with herbivores that they come to kill, sometimes like goats and moose, etc., those hunters are not allowed to bring back the meat. So these are never about sustenance. These are not meat hunts. These are trophy hunts, to be clear, that targeted, well, formally targeted grizzly bears before the ban that may or may not remain in place, black bears, wolves, mountain lions, and more. And so Rankos came in and thought, we've been campaigning against this unethical behavior for a decade or more. And we're not beating them in this way. So if we can't beat them, let's buy them. So what Raincoast did uniquely, and other people, including First Nations from the North Coast, have replicated, is buying these licenses. So Raincoast becomes the guide outfitter. We take out people hunting for these animals, but they do so not with rifles, but with cameras, fulfilling the letter of the law under the Wildlife Act and other relevant guidelines and laws in British Columbia. Buy even the kill tags for many of these animals, get assigned a quota, an allocation of many of these or all of these sensitive species. And instead of killing them and removing them, we shoot them not once, but many times with a camera. So these individuals are left to be grizzly bears doing their thing, wolves doing their thing, mountain lions doing their things, goats, moose, etc. So it's a beautiful, creative, very effective, what we call conservation economic solution for I think a reasonable investment on the order of, depending on the territory, several $100,000 to a few $1,000,000. We gain in perpetuity the right to effectively, in essence and in reality, to extinguish this trophy hunting now and into the future. So it's a beautiful thing. I'm really proud that Rankos has done that. And I know we are furiously looking for investors to join us on this next purchase.
Yeah, and before we end this episode, I'll fill everyone in with a little bit more details on that. Um, and having these large carnivores on the landscape, I wonder from an ecocentric perspective, and I mean perhaps even an anthropocentric perspective as well. What is the value of having large carnivores like wolves and bears on the landscape?
Yeah, they do tremendous ecological services for us. I've stepped through how they provide for us, wolves, in a few different ways. Grizzly bears can do the same. They're tremendously important and increasingly so in ecotourism and what we call non-consumptive or minimally intrusive extracting of revenue from these animals without killing them or harassing them. So that's a beautiful thing in the sort of human centric values. And then, to complement the ecocentric and the anthropocentric, maybe economic views, I also would point out that they have, I believe, inherent value that is not expressed in what they do for the ecosystem or they do for us, but just their inherent value to deserve to live lives unencumbered by people extracting them, causing them suffering, etc. I believe, especially in the context of large carnivores, that should not be hunted for sport and trophy. Let's face it, they deserve big chunks of the landscape, and as we do through the guide outfitting buyouts, to just be wolves or mountain lions or grizzly bears or black bears, etc.
I agree. Yeah. And so societal values, as we've talked a little bit about, they can change and have changed a lot since the current wildlife management paradigms were created.
Yep.
But this change takes time. And I'm wondering if you can answer kind of how those listening and perhaps those who hold values that favor safeguarding animals from trophy hunting can influence change in policy regarding wolves and other large carnivores.
Yeah, as I think I've hopefully illustrated, that the values of that society or a good chunk of society holds can be enormously influential at um, dictating how policymakers make policies. And in the context of wildlife management, we are moving away from a paradigm that exclusively and narrowly focused on, is there enough of this critter to kill some of them so we'll have the same number of critters next year? A strictly numerical population demographic view, to one that asks a question, a very important upstream question: should we be killing these animals? Does society support the idea of killing these animals for these reasons? And if, and only if, society says, yeah, this works for us by and large, then we can do some of the more narrow demographic analyses to try to understand how many animals can be safely removed from ecosystems and appear on kitchen dinner tables and in freezers, etc. But for in the context of thinking about safeguarding animals like wolves and other large carnivores, I believe, and there's now accumulating evidence, that if people that hold these values, and we know from surveys across North America, increasingly in the last generation, now most people believe that large carnivores should not be hunted for sport and trophy. If even a modest fraction of those people enthusiastically, frequently, effectively communicated those values and their specific attitudes about those hunts to policymakers, I suspect and would expect things to change, as they did for the grizzly bear hunt being closed in BC, as they did with the closure of the mountain lion hunting in California now decades ago. To be sure, there will be challenges. The pro trophy sport hunting anti carnivore lobby is extraordinarily powerful. and this will always pose a challenge. But I believe the arc that we are well established on will lead to more changes, like the end of grizzly bear hunting in BC that we've experienced 5 years ago, and perhaps the end of wolf hunting in BC sometime in the future. And for that, I thank people like you, Chelsea, involved in such campaigning efforts on the Rain Coast team, and others, many of whom may be watching now or will be watching this. So to you all, I thank you.
Great. Well, it seems that we're at time, and I think that this was a really great piece to end on. So I just want to thank everyone in our audience for taking the time to join us tonight and for all of the thoughtful comments and questions. Chris, thank you so much for all the time and effort that you put into tonight, and other colleagues at Raincoast who have made this happen. In addition to our collaborators, the Wolf Conservation Center, if you're interested in learning more about wolf conservation, please stay tuned for the rest of the series. We are hoping to pull together one last episode for you all, so please keep an eye out for an email with updates on that. You can also visit the Wolf Conservation Center in person or on their website, which is just on the banner below. You can also visit raincoast.org. I'll just add the banner there to find out more information about wolves. Also, if you're interested in learning more about the ethical, philosophical, and social dimensions of predator management and its complexities as a conservation action, Raincoast is currently curating a written series called Wolf Stories, which will be contributed by expert philosophers, ethicists, knowledge holders, animal welfare scientists, conservation biologists, and so many more important folks. And the first article of the series will hopefully be published on our website next week. And then lastly, Chris and I touched on this briefly in our discussions today. I'm just going to add a photo here. But in addition to the 38,000 square kilometers of commercial hunting tenures purchased, we are currently raising funds to stop the commercial trophy hunting in more than a quarter of the Great Bear Rainforest. So this is a Great Bear Rainforest. The green stuff is what we've already purchased. The blue is what we're currently campaigning to purchase. We've already raised over half of our total goal of 1.92 million, but we do really need your help to get us to the finish line by the end of the year. So if this is something you can support, it would be greatly appreciated. And to learn more about this campaign, you can visit Raincoast at the link that I provided below. And with that, I just want to pass it back to Chris for any final words. Someone did ask in the chat where you got your cool wolf shirt, so you can tell people where they can pick one up.
I wish I knew the name of the shop. It's an incredible shirt gifted to me by my sister, Jessie Housty of the Helsik or Haisuk First Nation of Bella Bella. It glows in the dark. And it has the same image on the back. Thank you for noticing. I wore it especially for this event.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, everyone. We're going to close the feed, but have a wonderful evening. And yes, thank you, Chris, again, and bye for now.
Thank you all. Night, night.